Dakota Territory, spring 1873. Fletcher Yates believed that love was a luxury the frontier could not afford, a weakness that would get a man killed faster than a rattlesnake bite. At 25 years old, he had already buried enough dreams in the hard Dakota soil to know that survival meant keeping your heart as guarded as your gun hand. The wind that swept across the grasslands carried only dust and disappointment, never promises worth keeping. He stood outside the general store in Redemption, a town that barely deserved the name, watching storm clouds gather over the Badlands. His broad shoulders filled out a worn leather vest, and his dark blonde hair caught the fading sunlight beneath the brim of his black hat. Clean-shaven and lean-muscled from years of ranch work, Fletcher had the kind of face that might have softened into kindness if the frontier had not taught him to keep his jaw tight and his eyes wary. The Yates Ranch, 10 miles south of town, was all Fletcher had left of his father's legacy. 2 years ago, a winter so brutal it earned its own name in local history had taken his parents and 2 younger brothers. Fletcher had survived by going numb, by treating each day like a range war where feelings were the enemy. He told himself he wanted nothing more than to keep the ranch running, to prove he could endure what the land threw at him. But in the hollow hours before dawn, when even the coyotes fell silent, he felt something gnaw at him that no amount of whiskey could quiet. "Rider coming in fast," called out Tom Morrison, the storekeeper, squinting toward the eastern road. Fletcher turned, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt revolver on his hip. In Dakota Territory, speed meant trouble. A single horse galloped toward town, and even from a distance, Fletcher could see the rider swaying dangerously in the saddle. As the horse thundered closer, his breath caught. It was not a man at all. The rider was a woman, her dark brown hair torn loose from its pins and streaming behind her like a battle flag. Her emerald green dress was torn at the shoulder, and blood stained the fabric. She clung to the saddle horn with both hands, her face pale as moonlight. 20 yards from the store, her grip failed. She tumbled from the horse and hit the dirt hard. Fletcher ran. His boots pounded the packed earth as he covered the distance in seconds, dropping to his knees beside her. Up close, he could see she was young, perhaps 21 or 22, with delicate features now twisted in pain. A gash above her left temple bled freely, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. "Someone get Doc Harrison," Fletcher shouted over his shoulder. He stripped off his bandana and pressed it gently against her wound. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of a summer sky. "They killed him," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They killed my father." Who did this?" "Garrett's men we would not sell." "We would not." Her eyes rolled back and she went limp in his arms. Fletcher lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile against his chest. Something shifted in him as he carried her toward the doctor's office, something he had walled off so thoroughly he had forgotten its name. It felt like alarm, like responsibility, like the beginning of a promise he had sworn never to make. Doc Harrison met them at the door of his office, his silver beard stained with tobacco juice. "Put her on the table, son." "What happened?" "Do not know yet." She mentioned Garrett's men and her father being killed. The doctor's expression darkened. "Garrett, that snake has been pushing out every small rancher from here to the Missouri River." He began examining the woman's injuries with practiced efficiency. "She is lucky. The head wound looks worse than it is. Some bruised ribs, cuts and scrapes, but she will live." Fletcher should have left then. Should have walked out, gotten back to his own concerns, his own survival. Instead, he found himself asking, will she need someone to watch over her tonight? Doc Harrison gave him a long, measuring look. "She will need somewhere safe to stay for a few days, that is certain. I assume you are volunteering the Yates Ranch." "I did not say that." "You did not have to." The old doctor cleaned the woman's wound with steady hands. "Her name is Sarah Danner, if the papers in her saddlebag tell true. Her father owned a homestead about 40 miles northeast near the Cannonball River. Good land, from what I hear. The kind that makes men like Garrett greedy." Fletcher stared down at Sarah Danner's unconscious form, at the dark brown hair that spread across the white pillow, at the vulnerable curve of her throat. Every instinct he had honed over the past 2 years screamed at him to walk away. Getting involved meant complications. It meant caring whether she lived or died. It meant weakness. "She can stay at my place until she recovers," he heard himself say. but just until she is well enough to move on. Doc Harrison's eyes held a glimmer of something that might have been hope or might have been amusement. Of course, son. Just until she moves on. 3 hours later, Fletcher drove his wagon back toward his ranch with Sarah Danner unconscious in the bed behind him, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. The storm he had seen gathering finally broke, sending cold rain lashing across the grassland. Thunder rolled across the sky like artillery fire, and Fletcher urged his horses faster, suddenly desperate to get his unexpected charge out of the weather. The Yates ranch house was small but solid, built from thick timber his father had hauled from the Black Hills. Fletcher carried Sarah inside and laid her on his own bed, the only proper one in the house. He built up the fire in the stone hearth until the single room glowed with warmth, then sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing. What was he doing? This was exactly the kind of entanglement he had spent 2 years avoiding. She would recover, and then she would leave, and he would be left with nothing but another empty space at his table. The frontier gave nothing freely. Every attachment was a debt the land eventually called due with interest paid in grief. But as the storm raged outside and firelight played across Sarah's sleeping face, Fletcher found himself unable to look away. She had ridden 40 miles wounded, desperate for help, driven by something stronger than pain or fear. What kind of woman did that? What kind of strength lay hidden beneath that delicate exterior? Near midnight, her eyes opened. She stared at the rough timber ceiling for a long moment, disoriented, then her gaze found Fletcher sitting vigil in the chair. "Where am I?" Her voice was stronger now, though still edged with pain. "My ranch, you are safe." "I am Fletcher Yates." She tried to sit up and winced, her hand going to her bandaged ribs. "My father, I have to get back to him, I have to." "Easy." Fletcher rose and gently pressed her back against the pillows. "Doc Harrison sent word to the marshal. They will ride out to your homestead at first light." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks in silver tracks. "He is dead, I know he is dead. Garrett's men came at dawn, 5 of them. They said we had one last chance to sell, and when Papa refused, She turned her face away. "I ran, God help me, I ran while they were killing him." "You came for help, that was not running away." "Was it not?" Her voice broke. "I left him there alone." Fletcher had no answer for that. He had never left his family alone. He had been there when they died, had held his youngest brother as the cold took him, had watched helplessly as the brutal winter claimed them one by one. Was it better to watch or to flee? He could not say which burden weighed heavier. "You should rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow we will figure out what comes next." "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked, her blue eyes searching his face. "You do not know me." It was a fair question, and Fletcher had no good answer. "Because you fell from your horse in front of me, because something in your determination called to something buried in me, because for 2 years I have been telling myself that isolation equals strength, and in one moment you made me question everything." "Because it is the right thing to do," he said instead. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Yates, I will not impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." "Fletcher." "And it is no imposition." That was a lie, and they both knew it. She was already an imposition, already working her way under his carefully constructed defenses like water seeping through a dam. He should be terrified. Instead, he felt something stranger and more dangerous. He felt curious. Sarah slept fitfully through the night, crying out occasionally in dreams Fletcher could only imagine. Each time he was there, murmuring reassurances he did not quite believe himself, watching her settle back into restless sleep. When dawn finally broke gray and cold over the grassland, Fletcher's back ached from the chair, but he could not bring himself to regret the vigil. Marshal Wade Kendrick arrived mid-morning, his weathered face grim. He accepted Fletcher's offer of coffee and stood warming his hands by the fire while Sarah, now dressed in one of Fletcher's shirts over her torn dress, listened with growing horror to his report. "Your father is dead, Miss Danner, I am sorry. Looks like he put up a fight, took one of Garrett's men with him. The rest burned your homestead to the foundation." Sarah swayed and Fletcher caught her elbow, steadying her. She did not pull away from his touch. "And Garrett?" Fletcher asked, his voice hard. "John Garrett owns half the territory already, and he wants the other half. He has lawyers who can make anything look legal, and he has hired guns who make sure nobody asks too many questions. Your father's claim dies with him, Miss Danner. Without proof of Garrett's involvement, there is nothing I can do." "Nothing," Sarah pulled away from Fletcher, her eyes blazing through her tears. "My father is murdered, and you will do nothing." "I will do what I can, but that is not much against a man like Garrett. My advice, take whatever money you have and start over somewhere safe. California, maybe. Or back east." "No," Sarah's voice was steel. "That land is mine by right. My father died for it. I will not let Garrett steal it from his grave." Marshal Kendrick shook his head. "You are one woman alone against an army. Be smart, Miss Danner. Live to fight another day." After the marshal left, Sarah stood at the window, staring out at the endless grassland. Fletcher busied himself at the stove, making breakfast neither of them would eat, giving her space to grieve. Finally she spoke without turning. "You think I am foolish. I think you are brave and angry, and I understand both. But you think I should leave." Fletcher brought 2 plates to the rough wooden table and sat down. "I think the marshal is right that you cannot fight Garrett alone." "Then I will find help." She turned to face him, her chin raised in defiance. "I will hire men, I will rebuild, I will prove Garrett murdered my father." "With what money?" "The marshal said your homestead burned." Sarah's expression crumbled slightly, and Fletcher hated himself for pressing the point, but kindness, he had learned, sometimes meant speaking hard truths. "I have nothing," she admitted quietly. "But I will find a way." Here was the moment. Fletcher could give her traveling money, send her on her way, and return to the isolated existence he had convinced himself was strength. He could seal the cracks she had already opened in his armor and go back to the numb safety of caring for nothing beyond the next sunrise. Or he could take a chance. He could do the thing he had sworn never to do again. He could let someone matter. "You could stay here," Fletcher heard himself say. "Work for me. I need help running the ranch anyway. You could earn enough to get back on your feet, figure out your next move." Sarah's eyes widened. "You would do that?" "Knowing Garrett might come after anyone who helps me." "Garrett does not scare me." That was not entirely true. Any man with sense feared John Garrett, but Fletcher found that he feared the alternative more, the thought of Sarah riding off into danger alone, the thought of never knowing what happened to her, the thought of the empty chair at his table tomorrow morning. "Why?" Sarah asked again, echoing her question from the night before. "Why would you risk Garrett's anger for a stranger?" "Because you make me feel something besides numb. Because in your eyes I see reflected the person I used to be before the winter took everything. Because some part of me that I thought was dead woke up when you fell from that horse. Because it is the right thing to do," Fletcher repeated, though even he could hear the words rang hollow. Sarah crossed the room and sat down across from him at the table. This close, he could see flecks of darker blue in her eyes, like clouds in a clear sky. "I think you are lying, Fletcher Yates. But I think you are lying for good reasons." She extended her hand across the scarred wood. "I accept your offer." Her hand was smaller than his, but her grip was firm. The touch sent something electric through Fletcher's arm, a jolt of connection that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He told himself this was just business, just practicality. He told himself he could keep his distance, keep his heart locked away. He was already failing. The first weeks of Sarah's presence on the ranch passed in a blur of hard work and careful distance. Fletcher showed her the morning routine, feeding the chickens, milking the 2 cows, checking the small herd of cattle that grazed in the southern pasture. Sarah proved herself capable and uncomplaining, rising before dawn without prompting and working until her hands blistered. She had an easy way with the animals that Fletcher envied. The horses, usually skittish with strangers, nuzzled her pockets for treats. Even his cantankerous bull, who had kicked 2 hired hands into next week, stood placid while Sarah scratched between his horns. "You grew up around animals," Fletcher observed one morning, watching her gentle and nervous mare. "My father raised horses in Missouri before we came out here. He always said animals are better judges of character than people." She stroked the mare's neck. "They know when someone means them harm, and they know when someone is safe." "And am I safe?" Sarah looked at him over the mare's back, and something in her expression made Fletcher's breath catch. "I think you try very hard to be dangerous, Fletcher Yates, but yes, I think you are safe." He was not sure whether to be pleased or insulted. Instead, he changed the subject. We need supplies from town. You feel up to the ride. Are you asking if I am well enough or if I am brave enough to face people who will ask questions? Both, I suppose. Then the answer is yes to both. I will not hide here like I have something to be ashamed of. The ride to redemption took 2 hours across open grassland that rippled like a green ocean beneath the spring wind. Fletcher found himself acutely aware of Sarah riding beside him, the way she sat her horse with natural grace, the way the wind played with the loose strands of her dark brown hair, the way she tilted her face toward the sun as if drawing strength from its warmth. They had been alone together on the ranch, isolated in their own small world. But approaching town, Fletcher felt anxiety twist in his gut. People would talk. They were already talking, he was sure. Fletcher Yates, who swore off everything but survival, taking in a beautiful young woman, never mind that she slept in the spare room he had hastily cleared, that he had been nothing but respectful. The frontier loved gossip more than gold. Tom Morrison's store was busy when they arrived. Several ranchers stood around the pot-bellied stove, their conversation dying the moment Fletcher and Sarah walked through the door. Fletcher felt their eyes like brands, judging, calculating, spreading rumors that would be all over the territory by nightfall. "Fletcher," Tom greeted them with carefully neutral politeness. "Miss Danner. Good to see you up and about." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Sarah's voice was steady, her head high. "I need to place an order." While Sarah discussed supplies with Tom, Fletcher became aware of a presence at his elbow. He turned to find Carl Winters, a neighboring rancher whose spread bordered the Yates property to the west. "That is a dangerous game you are playing," Carl said quietly. "I am not playing any game. Miss Danner works for me. Garrett's men came around yesterday asking questions about her. They know she is with you." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "And what did you tell them?" "The truth, that she is at your place." "I am not going to lie for you, Fletcher. I have my own family to think about." Carl's expression was apologetic but firm. "You are a good man, but you are making a mistake. Garrett does not forgive and he does not forget." "Noted." Carl shook his head and walked away, leaving Fletcher with the cold certainty that trouble was coming. He should have known better. In Dakota Territory, kindness was not rewarded. It was exploited, punished, ground beneath the heel of men like John Garrett, who saw compassion as weakness to be leveraged. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Sarah had heard Carl's warning. Fletcher saw it in the tight set of her shoulders, the way she watched the horizon as if expecting riders to appear at any moment. "You can still change your mind," she said finally. "I could leave tonight, find work somewhere else." "Running again." She flinched at his words, and Fletcher immediately regretted them. That was unfair. "No, it was honest." Sarah pulled her horse to a stop. Fletcher reined in beside her. They sat there on the empty prairie, the wind carrying the sweet smell of grass and the distant call of a meadowlark. "I did run. From my father's murder and now from the consequences of your kindness. Maybe running is all I know how to do. Or maybe running is how you survive until you are strong enough to make a stand. Are you strong enough, Fletcher? Strong enough to face whatever Garrett sends?" It was a fair question. 2 years ago, Fletcher would have answered with the absolute confidence of youth. Now, hollowed out by loss and afraid of losing anything else, he was not sure. But looking at Sarah, seeing the hope and fear warring in her eyes, he found himself wanting to be that strong, for her, if not for himself. "I guess we will find out together." Something shifted between them in that moment, some unspoken acknowledgement that they were no longer strangers thrown together by chance. They were allies, perhaps. If Fletcher allowed himself to hope, they were becoming something more. That night, they sat on the porch after supper, watching stars multiply across the darkening sky. Sarah had taken to bringing out 2 cups of coffee after the dishes were done, and they would sit in comfortable silence, letting the day's work settle into their bones. "Tell me about your family," Sarah said. "The marshal mentioned you lost them." Fletcher's first instinct was to shut down the question, to retreat behind the walls he had built. But something about the gathering darkness, about Sarah's gentle presence beside him, made him want to answer. 2 winters ago, the winter of 71 they call it, worst cold anyone could remember. We ran out of firewood in January and there was no way to get more. The The snow was 12 feet deep in places. He stared at his coffee, at the steam rising in ghostly spirals. My father went first, then my mother a week later, I think from grief as much as cold. My brothers, they were 10 and 12, I held them both while they died. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers lacing through his. She said nothing because there was nothing to say, but her touch was an anchor keeping him from drowning in the memory. I swore after that I would never let anyone close again, Fletcher continued. Caring hurts too much. Love is a liability out here, it makes you weak. And now I am sitting on my porch holding hands with a woman I barely know, terrified that something will happen to her, and realizing all my walls were built on sand. Sarah squeezed his hand. I think your walls were built on pain, and that is stronger than sand, but pain makes poor foundation, it cracks under pressure. What should I build on instead? I do not know yet. But maybe we can figure it out together. They sat there until the coffee went cold, hands intertwined, neither willing to break the connection. Fletcher felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest, not the numbness he had wrapped around himself like armor, but something warm and terrifying and alive. It felt like hope. 3 days later, the riders came. Fletcher was in the barn repairing tack when he heard the thunder of hooves. He grabbed his rifle and stepped into the sunlight to find 6 men on horseback arranged in a semicircle around his house. Sarah stood on the porch, her face pale but defiant, holding the shotgun Fletcher had given her. The lead rider was a tall man with a cruel slash of a mouth and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He wore a fine black suit that looked absurd on horseback, and his holster was worked with silver. "You must be Fletcher Yates," the man said. His voice was cultured, almost gentle, which somehow made him more menacing. "I am John Garrett. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Miss Danner belongs to herself." Fletcher kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but his finger was near the trigger. "Come now, the Danner girl's father owed me money. Quite a lot of money, actually. Now that he is dead, his debts pass to his daughter. I am willing to be generous. She works for me for, say, 5 years, and we will call the debt settled." "She is not interested in your generosity." Garrett's cold eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Fletcher. "I admire loyalty, Mr. Yates, but misplaced loyalty is just another word for stupidity. I could burn your ranch the way I burned the Danner homestead. I could have my men kill you where you stand, or you could be smart. Send the girl out, and we will forget this unfortunate episode." Fletcher raised his rifle to his shoulder, the barrel aimed at Garrett's chest. Behind him, he heard the distinctive sound of Sarah cocking the shotgun. "You are outnumbered," Garrett observed mildly. "So were the Spartans at Thermopylae, did not end well for the Persians." "A learned cowboy, how refreshing." Garrett gathered his reins. "I will give you 3 days to reconsider. If the girl is not delivered to my ranch by sunset 3 days hence, I will take her myself. And I will make sure you watch what happens to her before I kill you." The riders wheeled and galloped away, leaving dust and dread in their wake. Fletcher lowered his rifle and turned to find Sarah trembling on the porch, the shotgun shaking in her hands. "I should go," she said. "I should leave tonight before he comes back." Fletcher climbed the porch steps and gently took the shotgun from her hands. "You heard him, he will just hunt you down. Running will not save you this time." "Then what will?" It was the question Fletcher had been turning over in his mind since Garrett rode away. The marshal would not help, the neighboring ranchers were too afraid. He could fight, but 6 guns against 2 was suicide, not courage, unless he made it someone else's fight. "How much did your father owe Garrett?" "Nothing, my father never borrowed from him." "Garrett is lying." "Can you prove it?" Sarah's expression crumpled. "All our papers burned with the house, but I know my father, he would never deal with a man like Garrett." An idea was forming in Fletcher's mind, dangerous and probably foolish, but the only option he could see. "What if we could prove Garrett murdered your father, not just to the marshal but to the whole territory, make it so expensive for him to come after you that he gives up?" "How?" "Garrett has to record his land claims somewhere. If he filed a claim on your father's homestead, it would be dated. If we could prove he filed it before your father died, we could show he planned the murder in advance. The land office is in Yankton." That is a 3-day ride. Then we better leave tomorrow. Sarah stared at him and Fletcher saw the moment hope rekindled in her eyes. You would do that, risk everything on a maybe. I think I would risk quite a lot for you, Sarah Danner. The words were out before Fletcher could stop them, honest and raw and terrifying. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. Why? Why do you care what happens to me? Because you make me feel alive again. Because your courage shames my cowardice. Because somewhere between watching you gentle horses and holding your hand on the porch, I stopped being afraid of what caring might cost and started being afraid of what not caring would cost instead. Because the frontier is no place for love, only survival, Fletcher said softly. That is what I told myself for 2 years, but I was wrong. Survival without something to live for is just slow dying. You make me want to live again. Sarah reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. I ran when my father was killed because I was terrified, but I am more terrified of running from this, from whatever this is between us. Fletcher covered her hand with his own. I cannot promise this will work. I cannot promise we will survive what is coming. I know, but I would rather face it with you than run away alone. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. Later, neither would remember who moved first. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and fierce, two people standing on the edge of an abyss and choosing to jump together. Her hands fisted in his shirt and his arms pulled her clothes, and for a moment the whole dangerous world fell away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. We leave at dawn, pack light and bring your father's pistol. I do not know how to shoot a pistol. Then I will teach you. If we are doing this, we are doing it prepared. They spent the evening by lamplight, Fletcher showing Sarah how to load, aim, and fire his spare Colt revolver. She was a quick study, her hands steady once she got over her initial nervousness. Outside, the night birds called to each other, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote howled. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. Fletcher tried to memorize them, afraid of what the coming days would bring. Do you think we will survive this? Sarah asked, sitting beside him on the porch after their shooting lesson, her shoulder pressed against his. I think we have to try. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have. She turned to look at him, her face serious in the moonlight. If we do survive, if we somehow beat Garrett and prove what he did, what happens then? What do you want to happen? I want to rebuild my father's homestead. I want to honor what he died for, but I also want, she trailed off, suddenly shy, want what? I want this, us. I want to see where this goes without guns and threats and fear. Is that foolish? Fletcher pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. If it is foolish, then we are both fools together. They sat there until the moon set and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, both aware that tomorrow they would ride toward danger, both choosing to take these last hours of peace and hold them close like a talisman against what was to come. The 3-day ride to Yankton tested every skill Fletcher possessed. He kept them off the main roads, following game trails and creek beds that would be harder for Garrett's men to track. They saw riders twice in the distance and hid in gullies until the danger passed. Sarah bore the rough conditions without complaint, though Fletcher could see the exhaustion in her eyes each night when they made cold camp, afraid a fire would give away their position. On the second night, huddled together for warmth beneath a single blanket, Sarah said, "Tell me something true." What do you mean? Something true about Fletcher Yates that nobody else knows. He thought for a moment, listening to the wind rustle through the prairie grass. I wanted to be a doctor before the winter, before everything. I had saved enough to go to medical school in Chicago. My father thought I was crazy, giving up the ranch for books and scalpels, but I wanted to help people, wanted to fix things instead of just enduring them. You still could after this is over. I am 25. Too old to start over. My father was 40 when he homesteaded in Dakota. It is never too late to start over. She shifted closer, her breath warm against his neck. Maybe we could both start over. You could be a doctor and I could raise horses like my father taught me. We could build something new together. It was a dream, nothing more. The kind of dream the frontier crushed beneath its heel with casual cruelty. But lying there under the stars with Sarah in his arms, Fletcher let himself believe in it. Just for a moment, he let himself imagine a future where they survived, where love was not a liability but a foundation, where starting over was possible. "I would like that," he whispered. "I would like that very much." They arrived in Yankton on the afternoon of the third day, dusty and exhausted. The town was 10 times the size of Redemption, with actual streets and boardwalks and buildings that stood more than 1 story tall. The land office was a brick structure near the courthouse, and Fletcher felt his heart pound as they tied their horses outside. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up from his ledgers with the weary expression of someone who dealt with desperate homesteaders all day, every day. "We need to see the land claims for the Cannonball River region," Fletcher said. "Specifically, any filed in the past 3 months. That will be $5. Fletcher paid and the clerk disappeared into a back room. He returned 10 minutes later with a large leather-bound book that he dropped onto the counter with a thud. "Sign here, you break it, you buy it." Fletcher and Sarah huddled over the book, flipping through pages of cramped handwriting. There were dozens of claims, hundreds. Fletcher's hope began to fade. They would never find it. They would never. Here, Sarah breathed. Her finger pointed to an entry dated 2 weeks before her father's death. John Garrett, claiming abandonment of the Danner homestead on the Cannonball River. "But your father was not dead yet." "Exactly. Garrett filed the claim before he killed him. He planned it. This proves he planned it." Fletcher stared at the entry, his mind racing. It was not quite proof of murder. A clever lawyer could argue Garrett filed the claim in good faith, believing the homestead was abandoned. But it was enough to raise serious questions, enough to make Garrett's story fall apart under scrutiny. "We need a copy," Fletcher said to the clerk, "an official copy with the territorial seal." "That will be another $5. Fletcher had $3 left. He looked at Sarah, who shook her head. They had spent everything getting here. "I need that copy," Fletcher said. "This is evidence in a murder case." The clerk's eyes narrowed. "Against who?" "John Garrett." The clerk's expression went carefully blank. "I cannot help you. Cannot or will not. Mr. Garrett is a prominent citizen and a generous benefactor to this office. I am not going to create documents that could be used against him without proper authorization from the marshal or a judge." Fletcher felt rage build in his chest, hot and bitter. Of course, Garrett had bought the land office just like he had bought everything else. They had ridden 3 days for nothing. Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him from saying something he would regret. "Thank you for your time," she said to the clerk, her voice poisonously sweet. Outside, Fletcher slammed his fist against the hitching post. "We were so close, we had proof, and that spineless bureaucrat would not give it to us. Then we will get it another way. Sarah, we cannot steal land office records. That is a federal crime." She smiled, and there was something wild and dangerous in it. "Who said anything about stealing? We just need to borrow them long enough to show the right people." They spent the next 2 hours watching the land office. The clerk left at 5 o'clock sharp, locking the door behind him. The building sat dark and empty, separated from its neighbors by narrow alleys on both sides. "This is a terrible idea," Fletcher said for the 3rd time. "You have a better one." He did not, so at midnight they crept through the alley to the back of the land office. The window was locked, but Fletcher had not grown up on a ranch without learning how to open stubborn things. The glass panes swung inward with barely a sound. Sarah went first, her smaller frame sliding through easily. Fletcher followed, trying not to think about how many laws they were breaking, how many years in prison this could cost them. Inside, the office smelled of ink and old paper and the ambitions of 1,000 desperate people seeking fresh starts on stolen land. Sarah found the ledger and carefully copied the relevant page by lamplight, her hand moving quickly across the paper. Fletcher kept watch at the window, his heart hammering. Every sound made him flinch, a mouse skittering across the floor, the building settling, the distant bark of a dog. "Done," Sarah whispered. She replaced the ledger and they slipped back out the window, pulling it closed behind them. They were 2 blocks away, walking casually like citizens with nothing to hide, when Fletcher heard the shout, "Stop, thieves!" They ran. Behind them, boots pounded on boardwalk and someone fired a pistol into the air. Fletcher grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her into an alley, then another, weaving through the dark streets. They reached their horses and mounted in one motion, spurring out of town at a gallop. The pursuit lasted until dawn. Fletcher pushed their horses harder than he should have, knowing they could not afford to be caught with the copied document. When they finally stopped to rest in a grove of cottonwoods, both horses were lathered and blowing hard. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I have ever done," Fletcher panted. Sarah pulled the folded paper from her dress. It was crumpled and sweat-stained, but the words were legible. "Evidence, proof, hope, it was worth it," she said. "Now we just have to get it to someone who will use it before Garrett kills us." The nearest federal marshal was in Bismarck, another 2-day ride, but they could not push the horses any harder. Fletcher made the decision to angle southwest instead, back toward Redemption. If they could get the document to Marshal Kendrick, he would have no choice but to act. Federal land fraud was outside Garrett's reach, no matter how much money he had. They rode through the day and into the night, taking turns sleeping in the saddle while the other kept watch. Fletcher had never been so tired. His eyes felt full of sand and his body ached from days in the saddle. But every time he looked at Sarah, determined, fierce, refusing to give up, he found the strength to keep going. 20 miles from Redemption, they found the road blocked. 6 riders sat their horses across the trail, dark shapes against the setting sun. Fletcher recognized the scarred man in the black suit immediately. John Garrett had been waiting for them. "You have led me on quite the chase, Mr. Yates," Garrett called, "all the way to Yankton and back. I am impressed by your dedication, if not your intelligence." Fletcher's hand dropped to his Colt, but he knew the numbers. 6 guns against 2, and both of them exhausted. They would die before they cleared leather. "The marshal knows," Fletcher said. "It was a lie, but maybe Garrett would believe it. We sent him proof of what you did to Sarah's father. You can kill us, but you cannot stop what is coming." Garrett laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Proof? You mean the childish forgery you stole from the land office?" The clerk was kind enough to inform me immediately. "No federal marshal will accept a document stolen by criminals running from justice." Fletcher felt the trap close around them. Of course Garrett had been informed. Of course he had gotten ahead of their plan. Men like Garrett did not get rich and powerful by leaving things to chance. "What do you want?" Fletcher asked. "The girl. I have always wanted the girl. Her father's land is valuable, but she is the real prize. Such spirit, such fire. She will make me an excellent wife, once I break her of these rebellious tendencies." Sarah spurred her horse forward before Fletcher could stop her. She pulled up 10 feet from Garrett, her hand near the pistol on her hip. "I would rather die." "That can be arranged, but watching Mr. Yates die first will be so much more entertaining, do you not think? I can make his death last hours, days, if I am feeling creative. Or you can come with me peacefully and I will let him ride away. He lives, you live, everyone is happy." "Sarah, do not," Fletcher said. She looked back at him and Fletcher saw her decision in her eyes. She was going to sacrifice herself, going to give herself to Garrett to save him. It was the most terrible kind of love, the kind that broke your heart even as it proved how much she cared. "I am sorry, Fletcher," she said softly. "But I cannot watch another person I love die because of me." She loved him, even now, even facing this, she loved him enough to say it, enough to make the choice that would destroy them both. Fletcher felt something crack open inside him, all the walls he had built shattering like glass. He had spent 2 years believing love was a weakness, but Sarah was not weak. She was the strongest person he had ever known. And if she could be that brave, that selfless, then he could be brave too. "No," Fletcher said. He urged his horse forward to stand beside Sarah. "We both ride away or we both die here. But I will be damned before I let you face this alone." Garrett's smile faded. "How touching, then you will both die." The 6 guns came up in unison. Fletcher drew his Colt, knowing it was futile, knowing he would not even get off a shot. At least they would die together. At least Sarah would know he loved her too, loved her enough to make the same sacrifice she was willing to make for him. The first shot cracked across the prairie like thunder. But it was not Garrett's men who fired. Riders poured over the ridge behind them, dozens of them, spreading out in a line. Fletcher recognized Carl Winters in the lead and Tom Morrison beside him and other ranchers from around Redemption. They must have followed. Garrett's men must have decided that enough was enough. I believe the odds just changed, Marshal Kendrick called, riding forward with his rifle aimed at Garrett. Drop your guns. You are all under arrest for attempted murder. Garrett's men looked at each other, calculating. 6 guns against 30 was no fight at all. One by one they dropped their weapons. Garrett's face twisted with rage. You have no authority here, Marshal. These men are simply escorting me home. Funny thing, Marshal Kendrick said, dismounting. A federal marshal arrived in town yesterday, investigating land fraud in the territory. When I showed him the copy of the land office documents that Mr. Yates so thoughtfully sent ahead by telegraph from Yankton, he got very interested in your activities, Mr. Garrett. Seems filing a claim on occupied land is a federal offense, and when that occupant turns up dead 2 weeks later, well, that looks mighty suspicious. Fletcher's head spun. Telegraph from Yankton. He had sent no telegram. He looked at Sarah, who looked equally confused. Carl Winters rode up beside them, grinning. You two are not as sneaky as you think. We have been following you since you left for Yankton, making sure Garrett did not catch you alone. When you stopped to rest outside Yankton, I rode ahead and sent the telegram to the marshal. Figured you would need all the help you could get. But why, Fletcher asked, why risk Garrett's anger? Carl's expression turned serious. Because we were all cowards, Fletcher. We let Garrett pick us off one by one, too afraid to stand together. But watching you risk everything for Miss Danner, watching you not give up even when any sane man would have run. It shamed us into remembering what we used to be before fear made us small. Marshal Kendrick snapped handcuffs on Garrett and began securing the other prisoners. Sarah dismounted and threw her arms around Fletcher, nearly pulling him from his horse. He caught her, holding her tight as the last of the adrenaline drained away, leaving him shaking. We did it, she whispered against his chest. We actually did it. We had help. We had friends. She pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face. You were right, the frontier is no place for love only if you try to face it alone, but together we can survive anything. Fletcher kissed her, not caring that they had an audience, not caring about anything except the woman in his arms and the future that had suddenly become possible. When they finally broke apart, they found the assembled ranchers politely looking elsewhere, though Carl Winters was openly grinning. I think there might be a wedding in Redemption's future, Carl called. I will start spreading the word. Sarah blushed, but she did not deny it. Neither did Fletcher. Some promises did not need words. The trial of John Garrett became the talk of Dakota Territory. The federal prosecutor brought charges of land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and a dozen other crimes that carried weight even on the lawless frontier. The scarred man in the black suit looked smaller in the courtroom, stripped of his hired guns and his reputation for invincibility. Sarah testified about her father's murder with clear-eyed courage that left the courtroom silent. Fletcher testified about the land office records and Garrett's attempts to silence them. But the real blow came when 3 of Garrett's own men turned state's evidence, hoping for lighter sentences. They described in detail how Garrett ordered the attack on the Danner homestead, how he had planned to force Sarah into marriage or kill anyone who protected her. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. Garrett would spend the rest of his life in federal prison in Michigan, far from the territory he had terrorized for so long. His ranch and holdings were seized to pay restitution to his victims. The Danner homestead land, along with a substantial settlement, was returned to Sarah. Standing on the courthouse steps after the verdict, Fletcher felt Sarah take his hand. It is really over, she said, as if she could not quite believe it. The hard part is, now comes the good part. What is the good part? Building the life we talked about under the stars. Sarah smiled, and Fletcher thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. Then we better get started. They were married in Redemption's small church 3 weeks later, on a bright June morning when the prairie bloomed with wildflowers. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Carl Winters' wife had altered to fit, and Fletcher wore his best suit, brushed clean of trail dust for the first time in years. Marshal Kendrick stood as Fletcher's best man, and Mrs. Winters stood for Sarah, who had no family left. But as Fletcher looked out at the packed church, ranchers and townsfolk who had once been too afraid to help, now gathered to celebrate, he realized Sarah was wrong. She did have family. They both did. Sometimes family was not blood. Sometimes it was the people who stood with you when standing was the hardest thing in the world. Do you, Fletcher Yates, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Fletcher looked into Sarah's blue eyes and saw his whole future reflected there. A future that included joy and struggle, prosperity and hardship, all the things the frontier could throw at them, but they would face it together. I do. And do you, Sarah Danner, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Sarah said, and her voice carried no doubt, no hesitation, no fear. When Fletcher kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers. He pulled Sarah close and felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. He had spent 2 years believing that love was a weakness, but he had been wrong. Love was the strongest thing he possessed. They rebuilt the Danner homestead that summer, the whole community turning out to help. The new house was larger than the old one, with room for the family Fletcher and Sarah both hoped for. They combined Fletcher's cattle with Sarah's dream of raising horses, creating a ranch that would become one of the most successful in the territory. But success measured in cattle and coins was not what transformed them. It was the small moments, Sarah's hand finding his across the dinner table, the sound of her laughter when he said something foolish, waking up each morning to her face on the pillow beside his. It was building something together, not in isolation but in partnership. 2 years after their wedding, Fletcher sat on the porch of their home, watching Sarah in the corral with a magnificent black stallion she was gentling. She moved with the horse in that graceful way she had, speaking softly, earning trust instead of demanding it. At her feet, a dark-haired little boy, not yet 2 years old, played with wooden blocks Fletcher had carved. Carl Winters rode up the lane and dismounted, joining Fletcher on the porch. "That son of yours is going to be a heartbreaker," he observed, "takes after his mother. Speaking of which, I hear there is going to be another little Yates before winter." Fletcher smiled. Sarah had told him just that morning, her eyes shining with joy and just a touch of nervousness. "Seems so." "You two certainly changed things around here," Carl said. "I remember when you swore off anything but survival. Now look at you, married, raising children, half the young ranchers in the territory coming to you for advice on running an honest operation." "You all changed things," Fletcher corrected. "Sarah and I just gave you a reason to remember you were not alone." "Well, however it happened, I am grateful. This territory is finally becoming the kind of place worth building a life in." After Carl left, Sarah came up to the porch, their son balanced on her hip. She settled beside Fletcher and he put his arm around her, marveling as he always did that this was real, that she was his, that they had built this life from the ashes of loss and fear. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked. "How wrong I was about everything." "Everything." "I thought the frontier was no place for love. I thought survival meant staying numb, keeping everyone at a distance. I thought caring was a weakness that would destroy me. And now—" Fletcher pulled her closer, kissed her temple where a faint scar remained from the day she fell from her horse into his life. "Now I know that loving you is the bravest thing I have ever done, and it turns out courage is contagious. By being brave enough to ask for help, we helped everyone else remember how to be brave too." Their son reached up and patted Fletcher's face with a chubby hand, and Sarah laughed. The sound carried across the prairie, mixing with the wind and the birdsong and all the ordinary sounds of a life well lived. In the years that followed, the story of Fletcher Yates and Sarah Danner became the stuff of frontier legend. People spoke of how a cowboy took a chance on love when it would have been easier to turn away, and how that single act of courage rippled outward, transforming an entire territory from a place ruled by fear into a community bound by hope. They raised 4 children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters who grew up learning that the frontier was both harsh and beautiful, that survival required strength but living required love. The ranch prospered and so did the territory around it. Fletcher never did become a doctor, but he was known for 50 miles as a man who would help anyone in need, who remembered what it meant to care when caring was hard. Sarah fulfilled her father's dream, becoming the finest horse breeder in Dakota Territory. Her horses were prized for their intelligence and their spirit, qualities that everyone agreed reflected their owner. She never forgot the day she rode into redemption with her life bleeding out, desperate and alone, and found a man brave enough to help when help was dangerous. And Fletcher never forgot the moment Sarah fell from her horse and shattered every lie he had told himself about love and weakness and what it took to truly survive. She had not made him weak, she had made him whole. On warm summer evenings you could find them on their porch, watching the sun set over the prairie that had once seemed so hostile and now felt like home. Their children would be playing in the yard, their grandchildren running wild as the next generation always did. And Fletcher would take Sarah's hand, weathered now by years of hard work and harder love, and think about the words he had once believed with absolute certainty. The frontier is no place for love, only survival. He had been so wrong. The truth was simpler and more profound. Love was survival. Love was the only thing that made surviving worthwhile. And by choosing love when it would have been easier to choose isolation, Fletcher and Sarah had not just changed their own lives. They had changed the Wild West forever, proving that even in the harshest landscape, in the most unforgiving circumstances, love could not just survive but flourish, transforming fear into courage and strangers into family. Their journey together had started with a fall from a horse and a cowboy choosing compassion over caution. It had been tested by violence and greed and all the casual cruelty the frontier could muster. But it endured, as love always endures when two people are brave enough to fight for it. And in the end, that was the legacy Fletcher Yates and Sarah Danner left behind, not wealth or land or fame, but the simple, revolutionary proof that love was not a luxury the frontier could not afford. It was the foundation on which everything worth building had to rest. That was how a cowboy took a chance on love, and their journey together changed the Wild West forever.